I was still in my boxers sipping lukewarm coffee on my dock when Karen pointed at me from across the water and screamed like I was holding her hostage. Moments later, 2 squad cars rolled up, sirens blaring, and I found myself explaining to deputies why my own dock on my own lake had become the scene of a supposed crime. The funny part was Karen had trespassed just to accuse me of it. It had started like any ordinary morning. The lake was still, a couple of ducks glided lazily through the water, and the air smelled like pine and damp earth. My old lab Rusty lay snoring beside me with one paw twitching in his sleep. I rocked gently in my chair watching the steam rise from my chipped Navy mug when the piece shattered. Karen's voice cut through the air like a busted lawnmower engine, shrill and unstoppable. She was yelling across the lake from her backyard, holding a bright orange folder high above her head as if it were a badge of authority. I stood up slowly. Karen had a reputation, and not the good kind. She had been president of the HOA for 2 years and had treated it like her personal dictatorship from day one. Last summer, she fined a neighbor for having mismatched patio chairs. The winter before that, she tried to outlaw wind chimes because they were, in her words, psychologically disruptive. I wasn't technically in the HOA. My land predates the whole neighborhood development by at least a decade, but that hadn't stopped Karen from trying to include me in her reign of terror. This time, though, she came prepared. She marched right over to my property, waving her violation notice like it was a subpoena. I met her halfway, trying to keep Rusty from charging ahead and doing something heroic. She had 2 younger men trailing behind her, clipboard-carrying lackeys from the board who looked about as comfortable as cats in a dog park. Karen didn't waste a second. She pointed at my dock like it was some kind of cursed structure. "This dock is non-compliant and must be removed immediately. You have 48 hours or you'll be fined $500 a day until it's gone. Also, your presence on it today violates the HOA's shared space policies." I blinked at her. My presence on my own dock on my own lake violates what now? Karen gave that smug smile she practiced in her bathroom mirror, the one that made me itch just looking at it. The lake is now part of the HOA community common areas. That includes all structures touching or extending into the water. I let out a small laugh and gestured toward my land. "Karen, this entire lake is mine. It came with the property when I bought it. Check your map." She leaned forward like a school principal about to suspend a kid for sarcasm. "We had a vote at the last HOA meeting. You weren't present, but the motion passed. The community now considers the lake a shared recreational zone." I was speechless, and I fought in courtrooms, engineering boards, and city zoning battles, but never had I encountered such raw entitlement. I didn't even argue. I just stepped back and smiled. That's when Karen doubled down. She pulled out her phone and began recording, narrating as if she were broadcasting a crime live. "As you can see, this resident is occupying a non-compliant structure and has refused to follow HOA protocol. We may need to escalate this for community safety." I chuckled. I wasn't about to get into a shouting match on video, especially not one with dramatic finger-pointing and Rusty barking in the background. I told her to get off my land and turned around. That's when she made the mistake of calling 911 and telling dispatch I was illegally detaining her on the dock. Within minutes, 2 patrol cars showed up, lights flashing, tires crunching on gravel. The officers were polite but clearly irritated. They separated us and took statements. When I handed over my original deed, complete with county-verified plat maps showing my property lines and lake bed ownership, one of the deputies raised an eyebrow so high it nearly left his forehead. "You own the whole lake?" "Yes, sir. Bought it outright before the HOA even existed." He nodded slowly and turned to Karen, who was still trying to explain her community bylaws like they overruled property law. When he asked if she had any legal claim to the land or the water, she went silent. The deputies advised her to leave immediately unless she wanted to face a trespassing charge. Karen stormed off with her clipboard brigade in tow, muttering something about having the board take care of it. I stood there, half amused and half furious. This wasn't over. I knew it. Karen wasn't the type to admit defeat, and her ego had just taken a public bruising. That night, I grilled a steak on the patio and reread my deed twice just to calm down. The sunset was a fiery orange, the kind you only get in places untouched by city smog. I looked out at the lake and made a decision. If Karen wanted to play games with water, maybe it was time I reminded her just who held the valve. I dusted off the old file cabinet in the garage and pulled out a folder labeled Lake Project. Inside were engineering notes, blueprints, and the original permits from when I'd helped build the lake's inflow and outflow system. I flipped through diagrams of the sluice gate and emergency overflow channels, and it all came back to me. The entire body of water, right down to the gate valves, was mine, legally, mechanically, completely. The HOA might think it owned the rules, but I owned the water, and that meant I could do something they'd never expect: drain every last drop. The next morning, I stood in front of the county clerk's office with a manila folder tucked under my arm and a head full of steam. The events from yesterday hadn't left my mind for a second. Karen's stunt with the police wasn't just ridiculous, it was a declaration of war. She crossed a line, and now it was time to draw mine. I had built my life on this land. The dock wasn't some haphazard platform of rotting wood. It was a hand-built tribute to my years in naval engineering, a quiet place where I'd fished with my late wife, taught my kids to cast lines, and now watched the world go by. To have that turned into some HOA violation, that was more than disrespect. It was personal. Inside the clerk's office, the air smelled like paper and coffee, and an older gentleman named Walt greeted me with a sleepy nod. He'd been working this job since before email was a thing, and if anyone could help me dig up the documents I needed, it was Walt. I laid my request out clearly. I needed the deed history of my land, including lake bed ownership, property lines, and anything tied to water rights. Walt scratched his beard, opened a drawer, and muttered something about how this town used to be simpler. It took a while, but eventually he pulled out a thick binder filled with yellow documents, brittle with age. As we flipped through the pages together, I found what I was looking for. My original purchase included not just the acreage of land, but also full control of the lake and its shoreline, classified as private under a dated but legally valid agreement with the county. There was even a permit from the Army Corps of Engineers tied to the original water control infrastructure, still intact, still active. I thanked Walt and asked for certified copies. He smiled and told me it was the first time someone asked for those documents in over a decade. As I walked out with the file in hand, I felt calmer. This wasn't just about personal satisfaction anymore. This was about exposing the arrogance of a group of clipboard tyrants who thought they could rewrite reality with a vote. Back home, I scanned and saved every document, then wrote up a formal letter to the HOA. I included clear diagrams of the property lines, the lake ownership, and cited 3 different statutes that protected me from any of their claims. I sent it certified, return receipt requested, then emailed it for good measure. I expected silence, or maybe a grudging retreat. What I got instead made me laugh out loud. By that afternoon, Karen had posted a video to the neighborhood Facebook group. It showed her standing on a paddle boat in the middle of the lake, wearing a life vest, pointing dramatically at my dock in the distance. She narrated, explaining how I was refusing to comply with the HOA's Unified Lake Access Plan, claiming I was endangering community safety and creating an atmosphere of division. Her voice was steady, but her eyes darted as if even she wasn't buying what she was saying. What followed was pure theater. She interviewed a couple of hand-picked neighbors who voiced their deep concern over my dock's existence, one of whom had lived here only 6 months. Another claimed the dock was causing erosion to the shoreline despite the fact that the shoreline had remained unchanged for 15 years. Karen ended the video with a plea to the board for immediate action, saying the HOA could not be held hostage by a rogue resident clinging to outdated land rights. I watched the video twice, then leaned back in my chair and let Rusty rest his head on my foot. It was absurd. She was trying to turn my quiet dock into the villain of a community drama. What she didn't realize was that every time she opened her mouth, she dug herself deeper into a hole. The next day, the situation escalated again. As I was trimming the hedge along the lakeside, I saw Karen and 2 other board members walking along the edge of my property with a tape measure and a notepad. I walked over calmly, asking if they needed help locating the property marker. Karen jumped like she'd been caught stealing cookies. She said they were verifying lake encroachments. I informed her she was once again standing on private land and invited her to leave before I called the sheriff. One of the board members, a guy named Philip, asked if we could just talk this out. I told him I'd already provided every legal document proving ownership and that further trespass would be considered harassment. Karen huffed and turned away, muttering that I would regret being so uncooperative. That evening, I made my way down to the old pump house. The lock was rusted but still intact. Inside, it was dusty and filled with cobwebs, but the mechanical heart of the lake, the sluice controls, valves, and emergency spillway systems, still stood strong. I flipped on the solar generator and heard the familiar hum of gears warming up. I didn't need to do anything yet, but I wanted to be ready just in case Karen's ego pushed her into one more foolish move. I sat on the dock that night, watching the moon ripple on the water, and thought about how ridiculous this all was. I wasn't trying to cause problems. I wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. All I wanted was to be left alone to enjoy what I had built, to live in peace. But peace didn't seem to be an option when people like Karen were involved, people who mistook authority for ownership and rules for righteousness. She had turned this into a spectacle, and soon she would find out just how badly she'd underestimated the man with the valve. The last thing I did before bed was set a reminder on my phone. If I didn't hear from the HOA by noon the next day with a full retraction, I'd take the next step. The lake was quiet as ever, but it wouldn't stay that way for long. At exactly noon the following day, I stood at the edge of my dock, eyes on the shoreline where Karen's backyard met the water. There was no letter, no apology, no board member waving a white flag. Just the same smug silence, the kind that only comes from someone who believes they've already won. The HOA had made their choice. I was about to make mine. I walked down to the pump house with Rusty trailing behind, tail swaying with curiosity. Inside, I opened the control panel and turned on the master switch. The lights flickered, the motors whirred, and the sluice system, the same one I helped install decades ago, came alive like an old friend stretching its limbs. I flipped the valve to partial release. Nothing dramatic, not yet, just enough to lower the water line by about a foot over the next 12 hours. It wouldn't cause damage, but it would certainly get attention. By early evening, the lake was visibly different. Canoes sat lower. The shallow edges near the community beach revealed patches of mud and weed, and ducks waddled awkwardly through shrinking puddles. The HOA's precious paddle boat dock had started to tilt slightly as the water slipped away from its supports. From my dock, I could see Karen standing in her backyard, arms crossed, staring at the lake like it had personally betrayed her. Around dinner time, a message popped up on the neighborhood Facebook page. Karen had written a lengthy post blaming recent drought conditions for the water drop and asking residents to conserve water and report any suspicious activity near the pump house. I laughed so hard I nearly choked on my baked potato. Suspicious activity near my pump house. The one she didn't even know existed until last week. She was still trying to spin the story in her favor, clinging to control as it slipped through her fingers, just like the water draining from her beloved view. The next morning, I found a fresh surprise waiting for me. Karen, and what I assume was a last-ditch act of intimidation or sheer desperation, had hired a small construction crew to dismantle my dock. They were standing awkwardly at the shoreline with a toolbox and an orange permit stapled to a piece of plywood. One of them waved as if asking permission to proceed. I didn't say a word. I walked past them calmly, holding my phone in one hand and the certified property deed in the other. I called the county sheriff. By the time the deputies arrived, I had made sure the construction workers didn't so much as touch a single nail on my dock. Karen was already on the scene, pacing nervously and whispering instructions to the crew. The sheriff stepped between us, asked for documentation, and I handed him the same set of papers I'd shown days earlier. He read through them carefully. Then he turned to Karen and asked her to explain under what authority she had ordered work to begin on private property. She mumbled something about HOA jurisdiction and safety protocols, but it didn't hold water. The deputy told her flat out that unless she had a court order or written permission from me, she was trespassing and interfering with private property. Her face went red. The construction workers quickly packed up and left without saying a word. Karen tried to salvage the moment by claiming the HOA was within its rights to enforce community standards. The sheriff cut her off mid-sentence. This isn't a community matter. It's a legal one, and he owns this lake. Karen glared at me like I had just stolen Christmas. She turned without another word and stormed off. I thanked the deputies and shook their hands. Rusty wagged his tail like he'd just won a medal. That evening, I made my second move. I returned to the pump house and opened the sluice wider this time. The water would drop more noticeably, another 3 feet by morning, enough to leave every boat in the neighborhood stranded, enough to expose the muddy bottom near Karen's decorative boulder garden, which I might add, she had built 2 feet over my shoreline. By sunrise, the lake resembled more of a drained swimming pool than a peaceful body of water. The beach was gone. The neighborhood kids who once splashed and played by the water's edge now poked at the fish, flopping in mud with sticks. The HOA's bulletin board issued a formal notice that all lakeside activities were suspended until further notice due to environmental instability. Another line of spin, another desperate excuse. But not everyone was upset. That afternoon, Philip, one of the quieter board members, stopped by my property. He leaned against the fence with an uncertain expression and asked if we could talk. I let him in. He wasn't like Karen. He listened. I showed him everything. The documents, the pump house, the blueprints, the county map. By the end of it, his head was spinning. So you really do own everything? Even the outflow valve? Every inch, I said, and I gave them a chance to back off. He rubbed his face with both hands and sighed. I'll try to talk to them. Karen won't admit she's wrong, but maybe the rest of us can do something before this becomes permanent. I told him I appreciated the effort, but I wasn't putting the water back unless the HOA retracted every violation and dropped the nonsense about shared lake access. I also told him I was exploring a defamation claim. The online video Karen posted was still circulating, and I had every right to hold her accountable. Philip left looking older than when he arrived. I didn't enjoy it. I never wanted a war, but Karen had pushed, and I had finally pushed back. I'd warned her. I'd given her every opportunity to retreat with dignity, but she chose to escalate, and now she was watching the consequences seep into her perfectly landscaped backyard. I ended the night the way I always did, sitting on my dock with Rusty beside me. The water was noticeably farther away now, exposing the posts that once sat hidden beneath the surface. It was strange seeing it like that, vulnerable, honest, like the truth finally pulled out from beneath the lies. Karen had started this thinking she could win with rules and fear and public shaming. But this wasn't her turf. This wasn't her lake. And she was finally starting to understand just how deep she was in, and I hadn't even opened the main gate yet. The sound of metal grinding echoed through the hills like a beast waking from hibernation. I stood inside the pump house, one hand on the master valve, the other gripping the steel lever I hadn't moved in over a decade. It was time. The partial releases had made a statement, but now came the proof. I turned the lever slowly, unlocking the main floodgate, and felt a deep vibration roll through the concrete floor beneath my boot. The gate opened with a deep shudder, and then the rush came, fast and roaring as water poured out into the dry spillway that ran parallel to the hillside. The old overflow channel was still perfectly intact, and it drank the lake dry like a thirsty canyon. By late afternoon, the transformation was undeniable. What had once been a shining lake that reflected sunsets and cradled paddle boats had turned into a cracked basin of brown earth and glistening rocks. Waterfalls circled overhead in confusion, and the neighborhood kids stood on the edges with slack jaws, pointing and whispering. Karen's backyard looked absurd now, with her false beach chairs sitting in a patch of damp dirt and her little tiki torches poking out of the cracked shoreline like sad reminders of a party that would never happen again. Around 3:00 in the afternoon, I heard the low roar of helicopters. 2 of them circled the area, camera lenses gleaming in the sun. News vans pulled up near the neighborhood entrance. Apparently, someone had tipped off the media. I didn't need to guess who. the HOA, likely trying to frame me as a lunatic draining a public lake out of spite. What they didn't know was how easily the truth could fit into a press interview. One of the reporters, a young woman with a notepad and a camera crew in tow, approached my gate. She introduced herself and asked if I would speak on record. I figured why not. I let her in, walked her down to the edge of the dry basin, and told her everything. I showed her the deeds, the engineering permits, the correspondence with the HOA. I pointed out the exact boundary lines and the location of the original sluice system I had engineered and maintained for years. She listened, took notes, and asked if I had any regrets. I told her I had nothing against the community, but I would not be bullied off land that I legally owned. I said the HOA overstepped, ignored legal warnings, and tried to claim what wasn't theirs. I wasn't draining the lake out of revenge, I said. I was doing it to remind them that ownership matters, facts matter, and that if they tried to take something that didn't belong to them, there would be consequences. That night, the segment aired on the evening news. My calm interview ran right after footage of Karen nearly shouting into a microphone, demanding legal intervention and accusing me of environmental terrorism. She sounded unhinged. The contrast couldn't have been more perfect. Social media lit up, most siding with me. People loved a good underdog story, especially when it involved an overreaching HOA president being put in her place. The next morning, I got a letter slipped under my gate. It wasn't from Karen. It was from a group of homeowners, about 8 of them, asking for a meeting. They were worried, not just about property values, but about the direction the HOA had taken. They didn't all support what Karen had done. In fact, some of them had felt bullied into silence or compliance. They asked if there was any way to negotiate a solution that could restore peace and water without anyone losing face entirely. I agreed to meet on one condition, that Karen not be present. They accepted. We gathered at my back patio under the shade of the old cedar tree. I laid out the facts once again. I made it clear that while I wasn't against the community enjoying the lake, I would never tolerate false claims of shared ownership. I told them if the HOA formally rescinded its claims over the lake, dropped all fines and public accusations, and put in writing that I had exclusive ownership of the shoreline, I would consider closing the valve and allowing the lake to refill gradually over the next few weeks. One of the men asked about the damage to property values. I answered honestly. Yes, property values had dropped since the lake disappeared, but that wasn't on me. That was on the HOA. On Karen, I gave them printouts showing how the video she posted had contributed to the narrative of community instability. My lawyer had already filed a cease and desist and was drafting a lawsuit. If they wanted to prevent further damage, now was the time to act. That night, I got another knock. It was Philip, the soft-spoken board member who had visited before. He looked tired but also determined. The board just voted. Karen's been removed as president. We're rescinding all lake-related actions, effective immediately. We'll draft a new agreement for you to review. You win, Martin. I didn't feel like I'd won. Not really. I hadn't asked for a battle. I just wanted to be left alone. But if this meant an end to the harassment, if it meant I could sit on my dock without wondering who was spying with a clipboard, then maybe it was a win after all. Before Philip left, he hesitated and said, "Truth is, most of us had no idea you owned the lake. We assumed it was part of the common area." Karen made it sound simple. "That's how these things start," I said. "Someone makes it sound simple. Then they take what doesn't belong to them." By the next day, I received the new agreement by email. It was simple, direct, and exactly what I had asked for. The HOA acknowledged the lake as private property, confirmed I had full rights to control water access, and agreed to remove any past violation records tied to the dock. I signed it. Then I walked down to the pump house and turned the master valve shut. The lake wouldn't refill overnight, but the process had begun. And with it, something else returned. Balance. Karen might have played her last card, but I had the ace all along, not because I wanted to use it, but because sometimes when people refuse to listen to reason, you have to show them where the lines are. And sometimes you have to draw those lines in the mud. It took a little over a week for the water to rise back to its familiar line. Slowly, the dry brown edges softened. The boats found their way back to buoyancy, and the ducks returned like old friends who'd forgiven a grudge. The sound of moving water returned, trickling through the small creeks that fed the lake. Even the frogs started singing again, and yet something had shifted. The lake wasn't just a pretty background for barbecue parties anymore. It was a symbol, a reminder carved into every inch of shoreline that ownership had meaning, that boundaries mattered, and that no amount of HOA bluff could change a deed. Karen was nowhere to be seen the first few days after the board voted her out. She tried to keep up appearances. She walked the neighborhood with her arms crossed like she still had a gavel in her hand. But people had stopped waving. Conversations stopped when she approached. One morning, I watched her plant a new flower bed along the edge of her now muddy backyard. She kept glancing at the lake like it owed her something. Then, as if she could feel the weight of it all, she started avoiding the lake altogether. Word spread quickly that she had listed her house. No for sale sign on the lawn, but the online listings were easy to find. Price dropped twice in the first week. The once prime lakefront property now carried a cautionary tale. No one wanted to buy into a story where the villain still lived across the street. Neighbors started hosting casual barbecues and dock gatherings, not in celebration, but in subtle reclamation of peace. They were friendly again. No more cold glares or awkward silence. It was like someone had opened a window and let the stale air out. I received a small envelope in my mailbox one morning. No return address. Inside was a note, handwritten in tight, controlled cursive. It read, "I may have overstepped. You didn't deserve all that. I thought I was protecting the community. I see now I just made things worse." The signature was just KK. No apology, not really, but it was the closest Karen would probably ever come. I folded the note and tucked it into the same folder that held all the documents from the battle. I didn't hate her. I never had. But respect, once broken, is hard to rebuild. The new HOA board, now under Philip's guidance, kept their distance but remained cordial. They didn't try to take back control of the lake or ask for new rules. Instead, they focused on repairing fences, organizing neighborhood cleanup days, and rebuilding trust. Philip stopped by once with a small gift basket, more for Rusty than me, I think. We sat on the dock and talked about fishing, weather, and nothing in particular. The lake shimmered beside us, full again and peaceful. But the damage Karen had done wasn't just to her reputation or the board's integrity. It hit people in their wallets. Property values had dropped. Potential buyers pulled out. Rumors had swirled about legal issues, water access, and who controlled what. It took a while to quiet that noise. A few residents even approached me privately, asking if I'd consider selling water rights back to the HOA under a long-term access plan. I politely declined. I wasn't interested in deals or committees. I was interested in peace. One of the more satisfying moments came 2 weeks later when I rebuilt the dock, not because it needed repairs, but because I wanted it to stand taller, stronger, and impossible to ignore. I added a second tier, reinforced the supports, and gave it a fresh coat of sealant. On the final afternoon of construction, I stood back and looked at it from the shore. It gleamed under the sun like a monument to quiet resistance. A few neighbors wandered over and offered to help. Some brought drinks, others brought folding chairs and just watched. We ended up turning it into an impromptu gathering. Someone brought a speaker, someone else brought hot dogs, and soon enough, it was a full-blown lakeside hangout. No permission slips, no fines, just laughter, old stories, and the smell of grilled food in the air. Philip raised a drink in my direction and nodded. That one little gesture said more than words ever could. Karen's house eventually sold, not for the price she wanted, not even close, but someone finally took it on. On moving day, I stood on my dock and watched the truck back into her driveway. She didn't look up, didn't wave, just climbed into the passenger seat and let the driver pull her away from everything she had tried so hard to control. I didn't feel triumphant, just relieved it was over. Later that evening, I sat with Rusty on the dock, the water still and golden around us. I thought about how strange people could be, how something as simple as a piece of wood over water could spark so much chaos. But I also thought about resilience, about standing your ground not with fists or fury, but with patience, evidence, and quiet defiance. The lake reflected the sky like a mirror again. The wind moved gently across the surface. No shouting, no sirens, no declarations, just the sound of Rusty's soft breathing beside me and the distant call of a loon. I had drained the lake not out of anger but to make a point that had echoed louder than I expected. And now the lake was back, the land was respected, and the silence that returned wasn't empty. It was earned. It had been 3 weeks since Karen left, and life along the lake finally settled into a rhythm that felt almost too good to be true. Mornings were quiet again, the only sound being birds greeting the day and the soft lap of water against the dock's newly stained boards. I no longer looked over my shoulder when walking along the shoreline. I no longer worried about someone filming me through the bushes or sneaking by with a measuring tape. The tension that had once clung to the neighborhood like fog had lifted, and what remained was simple peace, the kind that only truly exists after a storm has passed. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now waved with genuine smiles. Some even brought over baked goods or stopped to chat during their evening walk. There was no mention of the dock war or the great draining, not directly, at least, but every now and then someone would say something like, "Glad that lake's looking better," or "Appreciate you taking care of the place." Like it was a subtle nod to what had unfolded. Philip visited twice more, once just to return a borrowed tool, and the second time with his teenage son to ask about fishing tips. We stood side by side on the dock as the boy cast a line into the glassy water, and it struck me how rare moments like that had become. Simple, honest, uncomplicated. The ducks had returned in full force, waddling up to my yard like they owned the place. I didn't mind. I even put out a shallow water tray for them on hotter days. Rusty gave them their space, though occasionally he'd bark once, just to remind them who was really in charge. The sunrises looked brighter, or maybe I was just noticing them more. Funny how you learn to appreciate the quiet after you've had someone shouting over it for too long. One Saturday morning, I got a knock at the gate. It was a young couple I hadn't met before, holding a small notepad and looking a bit nervous. They introduced themselves as the new owners of Karen's old place. Their names were Alex and Donna, and they had just moved in a few days ago. They explained they had heard some rumors about the lake and wanted to make sure they understood everything correctly. I invited them in, poured some iced tea, and walked them down to the edge of the dock. I explained everything calmly, the same way I had with the reporter weeks ago. Yes, the lake was mine. Yes, the shoreline was privately owned. But I had no problem with people enjoying it respectfully, as long as they understood the boundaries. They nodded the whole time, taking notes and occasionally asking questions. When I finished, Dana smiled and said she appreciated the clarity. Alex asked if I minded them putting a bench near the edge of their yard to sit and enjoy the view. I told them, of course not, just keep the tiki torches to a minimum. That got a laugh. They left with thanks and an invitation to dinner sometime. I might take them up on it. It felt good to start over without the weight of old battles dragging the future down. And watching them walk away hand in hand, it struck me that maybe the lake had been given a new start too. It wasn't just about the water. It was about the way it brought people together or drove them apart, depending on how it was handled. In the right hands, it was a blessing. In the wrong ones, a weapon. Karen had tried to use it as a power play, a trophy to hang her authority on. But nature, like people, doesn't like being controlled. It likes to flow freely. I decided to host a small gathering to mark the return of calm. Nothing formal, just a lakeside evening with burgers, lemonade, and a few lawn chairs. Word spread faster than I expected, and by sundown more than a dozen neighbors had shown up. Some brought side dishes, others brought guitars. Someone even brought a box of fireworks they'd forgotten to use last 4th of July. We sat along the dock, feet dangling over the water, talking and laughing under a sky that turned gold and purple and finally deep blue. At one point, Philip stood up and raised his drink, offering a short toast. He didn't mention the past, not directly, but his words carried weight. He thanked everyone for coming together, for sticking through difficult times, and for finding a way back to being neighbors again. Everyone clapped. Someone strummed a few notes on the guitar, and just like that, the gathering continued without missing a beat. Later, After the guests left and the last of the folding chairs were put away, I sat on the dock one last time. Rusty lay beside me, tired from the excitement, eyes half closed. The stars shimmered above, mirrored perfectly in the water. The moon cast a pale line across the surface, and the lake looked as peaceful as I had ever seen it. I thought about everything that had happened, about Karen's screaming, about the police visit, about the reporters and the legal threats and the dry basin, about the moment I turned the veil. And then I thought about now, the stillness, the laughter I had heard just hours ago, the way the ducks had come back. And so had the people. I didn't regret what I'd done. I hadn't acted out of spite. I had acted out of necessity. You can't let people take what's yours, not when you've built it with your own hands and protected it with everything you've got. The dock was more than wood and nails. It was a boundary, a story, a legacy. The lake was full again, not just with water, but with life. And I had made sure it stayed that way, not through shouting, not through threats, but through quiet, patient, unshakable resolve. And sitting there with the night wrapped around me and the water gently touching the shore, I knew one thing for sure. The next time someone came knocking with a clipboard and an agenda, I wouldn't raise my voice. I'd just smile, tip my hat, and ask them one simple question. Do you know who owns the lake? Because now everyone did.